Alright guys, how's it going? This is the third script that I've written on Zen 2 since Computex, and it'll be much shorter, more focused than the other two. For now, I'm just going to have a look at the announced Zen 2 CPUs and give my thoughts on them. Let's take a look over at AdoredTV.com. And Donnie's article, AMD announces Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, 15% higher IPC and up to 12 cores. I'll talk about that IPC gain later, and before I take a look at the CPUs that were actually announced, I will start with a discussion on the missing 16-core chips. Leading up to Computex, there was quite a lot of speculation that AMD would launch the 3000 series with a 12-core flagship part, the 16-core parts presumably coming later. And in this last Zen 2 video, the build up to Computex, I gave you a benchmark of the 16-core chip running CINEBENCH R15 and scoring nearly 4,300 points. But when Lisa didn't announce the 16-core chips at Computex, of course a bunch of people immediately jumped to the conclusion that there were no 16-core chips after all, and I was a lying SOB. But yes, there are 16-core chips, they just haven't been announced yet. Over at PC World, and Lisa Su, fresh from her Computex keynote and facing a horde of reporters, was asked, "There are people on the internet who expected to see a 16-core part. So Lisa, where's the 16-core part?" And Lisa's responding with, "You don't think we had enough content? You know how much stuff that we took out." So I guess that some of the stuff taken out included 16-core chips. But I don't think I need to guess, considering that at Computex, a few of the motherboard guys were doing precisely what AMD told them not to do, demoing the 16-core chip in secret. And Brian over at Tech City got an exclusive peek at it.
Now I did manage to meet up with a few people behind the scenes here and get some sneak footage from the water cooling guys, and they were saying that there is a 16-core 32-threaded option, and they did overclock it on water. And here's the kicker though, it did go up to around 4.1 gigahertz on what you would consider everyday overclocks. And they did manage to get it just shy of 4.3 gigahertz on all cores for those one-time runs.
So at 4 minutes 31 seconds, we see a screenshot of the CINEBENCH R15 run with this 16-core chip at 4.25 gigahertz. Scoring 4,346 CINEBENCH R15 points. Note that this isn't Threadripper, it's a 16-core Ryzen 3000 chip on the AM4 platform. Now as I said, in my previous video, just before the keynote, I leaked the first benchmark of this 16-core chip, which I claimed was running at 4.2 GHz and scoring 4,278 points. CINEBENCH scales almost linearly with cores and clock speeds. 4.25 GHz is 1.2% higher than 4.2 GHz, and 1.2% higher than 4,278 is 4,329. So these two results, my leak and then Brian's leak, are basically the same. So that is confirmation of my pre-Computex benchmark, live on video and taken by another YouTuber directly at the event. You still don't believe me? Okay, here is my image of the said 16-core chip running CINEBENCH R15. I've hidden the exact details. We can quite clearly see this is 4,000 plus points, and the chip is running at greater than 4 GHz. I've hidden the exact details, but you can see the important ones. I very slightly changed the numbers when I gave you what I did, but not enough to change the actual result, if you get my meaning. Also note this CPU string. In my screenshot, is identical to the one that Brian showed in his video, and it's also identical to the one that AppySac leaked a few weeks ago. As an interesting side note to this, Brian speculated that the clocks won't go an awful lot higher than 4 GHz on this 16-core part, as the one at Computex appeared to struggle to reach higher clocks than 4.1 GHz without a lot of effort being put into it. However, my source, who leaked the CINEBENCH R15 result to me, says that they believe there is a lock in the AGESA preventing higher clock speeds from being reached on the 16-core parts. That's pretty curious, and hopefully we'll hear more about that soon. But regardless of that, 16-core parts, are very clearly coming at some point. But until then, the flagship, and imagine I said that surrounded with quotes, is a 12-core part branded as the Ryzen 9 3900X. It has a base clock of 3.8 GHz and a boost of 4.6 GHz. 70MB total cache, as AMD are now including L2 in the total, and 105 watts TDP. Now, I'm sure you recall throughout the year when AMD, in particular Mark Papermaster, noted that 7nm offered around about 25% or more better performance over the previous node. We saw evidence of that with Vega 20, the 7nm Vega chip, which clocks 20% higher than the 14nm Vega 10, that's MI60 versus MI25, while using slightly less power as well, while also having double the bandwidth, VRAM and Infinity Fabric links. If you reduce clock speeds a little, 7nm transistors do give an improvement of around 30% clock speed at the same power. That's just pure transistor improvement from 14nm to 7nm. And we should have expected to see similar performance per watt improvements with Ryzen 3000, at least, if not even better due to the chiplet architecture. But the CPUs that AMD announced at Computex were a long way short of 30% faster. They were a long way short of 20% in fact. Let's just put all the relevant information into a table, concentrating on the fastest 8-core CPUs of each generation. It's a little bit shocking when you see the chips compared like this. Moving from GlobalFoundries 14nm to GlobalFoundries 12nm, saw the 2700X gain 3% higher base clock compared to the 1800X. However, that did come at a Ryzen TDP to 105 watts. But with that said, only 3.9 GHz base clock of the 3800X is only 8% higher than the 1800X's 3.6 GHz. I mean, just think about that. Vega 20 has around about 20% higher clock speeds at slightly lower power than Vega 10, even with double the bandwidth and VRAM. Yet with this 3800X here, we have only got 8% higher base clocks with an 11% higher TDP. And this TDP is important. I know people will say that TDP and power aren't the same, blah blah blah. I get it, but the fact is, the 2700X draws more power than the 1800X. 25 watts more, that is system power draw, but still 25 watts more in Blender, according to the tech report, and 19 watts more in CINEBENCH, according to Tech Power Up. AMD gave the 2700X a higher TDP of 105 watts compared to 95 watts of the 1800X. And given that the 3800X also has the same 105 watt TDP, we should logically expect it to fall in the same kind of power bracket as the 2700X, rather than the 1800X, or AMD would have given it the 95 watt TDP rating instead. If that is how this ends up, we are actually talking about a reduction in performance per watt for the 3800X compared to the 1800X. Now Zen 2 of course has the 15% higher IPC gain, and it's also got double the cache, don't forget that. So that does mean that there's no way that will be true in the real world. But at the transistor level, clock speed, the base clock and the power draw, that's what we are seeing here, at least on paper. 8% higher base clocks, 11% higher TDP. And judging by what we saw with the 2700X, this is more likely to be 20 instead of 10 watts of a difference. So that looks like a disaster. And the boost clocks aren't exactly inspiring either. According to this chart, the boost clock of the 2700X was more of an increase over the 1800X than what the 3800X will be over the 2700X. By this point, I'm really starting to wonder what it is that AMD has given us for this initial Ryzen 3000 announcement. So let's take a look at the whole new list of announced Ryzen 3000 chips to see if we can figure this one out. Starting with the top two, and at first glance, this looks pretty odd as well. How is it possible that the 3900X can have 50% more cores and a slightly higher boost clock compared to the 3800X, yet both have 105 watt TDP? It doesn't really add up, does it? Well, as it happens, this was something that some in the tech press suggested didn't make sense all those months ago, and Joel over at Extreme Tech, he had similar thoughts, saying that wildly different SKUs at similar TDPs just didn't add up. But today, we can clearly see comparing the 3900X and the 3800X appears to make just as little sense. There you have it, straight from AMD. You're looking at around a 50% difference in performance at the same TDP. The obvious answer to why this has happened is what I said it was in my response video way back in December. It's all about binning. The 12-core 3900X has better quality chiplets than this 8-core 3800X. Note that I said it's got better quality, not good quality. And the specs of this 3800X look especially dreadful when compared to the 65-watt 3700X. Same core count, an 8% higher base clock on the 3800X, and yet that comes at a cost of 62% higher TDP. And the 3700X should be the worst 8-core silicon available because it's the cheapest. It's the lowest branded and it's the cheapest. The issue here is very likely to be that these 8-core chiplets, there are so many other 8-core chiplets ahead of these in silicon quality. All of those high margin epics, they're going to need up to 8 of these 8-core chiplets. The very best performance per watt ones. Threadrippers, they're going to need 4. The 16-core Ryzen 3000 chips, when they finally arrive, they're going to need to have 2 of these 8-core chiplets. All of those chips are way ahead of the 3800X in terms of silicon quality. Even mobile 8-core chips will be well ahead of this 3800X in silicon quality. You got to understand that this 3800X, this really is bottom of the barrel silicon, and that is why it exhibits such terrible performance per watt. And for me, that's also what makes the price at $400 so unpalatable. Now, AMD were keen to point out the 3800X's gaming performance, and certainly compared to the 2700X, it looks to be a really great improvement. And this slide especially shows it. We're seeing a couple of 30% plus wins, a couple of 20% plus, and then a couple around the 10 to 15% mark. However, only 34% ahead in Counter-Strike could mean that it's still a long distance behind the 9900K in this game. At least if this benchmark over at Tech Epiphany is anything to go by. It's hard to tell exactly as there's no overall result, and in some parts the 2700X appears to be pretty close. However, in much of the benchmark, the 9900K is well over 50% ahead. Another possible issue was noted over at my Patreon Discord, when a comparison of the 9900K versus the 2700X in Grand Theft Auto 5, that appeared to suggest that the 3800X, assuming this 14% is correct against the 2700X, it will still be a long way behind the Intel chips in this game. But we know that Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of the worst cases for AMD chips. And I found it interesting that the 3800X's uplift compared to the 2700X's in this game was a lot less than in some of the others. Essentially, what I think we're looking at here is a game which likes a strong single thread while also making use of many cores. So I would read this plus 14% here as mainly being due to the extra IPC of Zen 2. But the thing is, you can see the performance is still well down, around 15% lower than the 9900K at stock. Again, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a bad game for AMD, as is Counter-Strike. But there are others, and the concern for me is that by not pushing to the limits on the 8-core desktop silicon, which they clearly have not done, AMD are leaving themselves open to a continuation of the current gamer mentality, which is that yes, 12 and 16 cores are great for productivity, but all I care about is the best gaming CPU. Now with that said, AMD also benchmarked the 3800X versus the 9900K in PUBG, which is another bad game for AMD, and the 3800X did come out ahead by 1%. However, I took a look at the footnotes in this, and we don't see any system specs, which is unusual for an AMD presentation. We normally get told the graphics card, everything about it. But the fact is here, we do not know what settings or setup that 1% win in PUBG came under, and it could easily have been a GPU bottleneck. So with all of this in mind, I'm not convinced that this 3800X is truly the new 8-core performance leader, at least not in gaming, which is a huge part of the 8-core market. For AMD, yes, clearly this is way ahead of the 2700X, which is great, but Intel just announced the 9900KS, 5GHz on all 8 cores. Intel knows what they need to do to remain ahead here, and this is likely it. And we might now expect Intel to aggressively pursue higher clocks all the way down their stack, possibly even enabling hyper-threading on everything. But at least we can say competition from AMD is driving some pressure on Intel. I hope my point here in what AMD is doing is clear though. I do not believe for a minute that this is the best 8-core option AMD could have offered. Nowhere near it. And I hope that those people who didn't want 12 and 16 cores, rather demanding the best 8-core option as a 9900K competitor, now understand the issue with that. AMD were never gonna give anywhere near the best silicon at the 8-core segment, because to AMD, 8 cores is currently smack in the middle of their range, and it will be lower to mid-range after the 16-core parts launch. And that is where it should have been priced. And that's where it should have been branded as a Ryzen 5, but due to a combination of higher prices everywhere, and Intel's lack of real competition versus the 3900X, AMD have just pushed the prices up a tier. Do you know why Vega 20 is 20% faster in clock speed than Vega 10? It's because AMD are in tough competition in GPU, and they need to push it as hard as they can. The Ryzen 3800X is only 8% faster in clock speed compared to the Ryzen 2700X, because this is how AMD feels they can make the most money segmenting the market while they're well ahead. I am not impressed by this, and from what I've read elsewhere, very few are. All the discussion around this 3800X has been around how can it be so inefficient compared to the 3900X? That is basically all I have read about this part. But with all that said, is it really as bad as I just made it sound? I'm calling this bad quality silicon, but it's also possible that it's leaky silicon. Leaky silicon is inefficient in performance per watt. You'd never see a chip like this in a data center or in mobile. However, leaky silicon tends to clock higher, and so this 3800X could be one of those. And we may just be looking at a real overclocking champion, possibly just about justifying the $400 price point. I guess with that, now is a good time to talk about why this current lineup is so confusing. 4.5 GHz boost looks pretty awful from a marketing perspective today, but maybe it's not actually that low. You remember, I said that the 12-core part boosts to 5 GHz. That information came from the same source that gave me the 16-core CINEBENCH result, which you just saw confirmed at Computex by Brian at Tech City. This is why I believed in 5 GHz in the last video, because this source has very obvious access to information. This was the first real leaked benchmark of the 16-core chip, and I had this nearly a month before Computex. So what happened then? Where is this 5 GHz boost 12-core? And the thing here is, they're nowhere near it, 4.6 GHz. That is quite some gap to close. 8.6% higher clock speed is required to reach 5 GHz. That is quite a lot. So was this source wrong for the first time? And at the worst possible time? Or maybe it was a bad sensor reading on the motherboard. Believe me, I have spent some time trying to figure out what the most likely reason is. And on the same day as Computex again, and yes, this also happened during CES on the same day, another random email dropped into my inbox from a person who claimed to know somebody in AMD marketing. I'll just read over the important parts of the email chain. So first things first, the 12-core Matisse will be the Ryzen 3800. Clock speeds are not high, but it's possible with manual overclocking to get up to 5 GHz. And it goes on to say the Ryzen 3700 will be an 8-core CPU. And with those numbers, you can guess that the 12-core Ryzen will be the highest priced Ryzen. Now, at first I didn't trust this information, especially due to the claim that the Ryzen 3800 would be the 12-core flagship chip. When I had been told by two different sources that the flagship model would be the 3800X, And my belief at the time was it would be a 16-core chip. As it turns out, all 4 of us were wrong, and AMD launched the 12-core 3900X instead. Another red flag for me was when reading that the clock speeds weren't that high at stock, but can manually overclock up to 5 GHz. I just didn't like that. My response was simple here. Why would that be the case? We know how AMD chips work, or have worked. They've barely got any headroom at all for overclocking, because Precision Boost kind of automatically overclocks the chip to the maximum anyway. So it doesn't really make sense for clock speeds to be low, yet the chips overclock to 5 GHz. The boost clock will be at least whatever the maximum overclock is. If the chips overclock to 5 GHz, they should Precision Boost to 5 GHz as well, at least on a single core. But then I realised AMD hadn't actually talked about XFR, Extended Frequency Range, at Computex. And so I figured, well, maybe that's the reason why. Could XFR make up this 8% gap between 4.6 and 5 GHz? And there's also Precision Boost Overdrive for current generation Threadripper chips, but that isn't an automatic feature, at least not yet. Was that the reason why the 12-core part boosted to 5 GHz? In my sources sample? I don't know, because AMD didn't discuss any of those extra technologies at Computex, but they presumably will soon. I just can't figure out how else this guy says 5 GHz overclockable is doable, and yet the chips were much lower clocked than that, which was true, but it also lines up with the 5 GHz info that my very accurate CINEBENCH source says. We will know soon enough if 4.6 GHz is the real limit of the silicon, or if it's just segmentation that AMD weren't doing previously with the 1800X and 2700X, because they were in competition at this time and they had to give their best shot with the 8-core chips. All of these current top-end Zen chips essentially boost to their maximum clock speeds due to Precision Boost and XFR. 2700X in particular boosts higher on a single core than it overclocks. So with that in mind, it's not really surprising that everybody is looking at this Zen 2 lineup and assuming the same thing. Basically assuming that 4.6 or 4.7 GHz maybe on the 16-core parts is where the chips will hit the clock speed wall. And in that case, we'll be lucky to even see 4.5 GHz overclocks. Call me a diehard, but I am sticking to 5 GHz until I see evidence otherwise. Unlike with the 1800X and 2700X, AMD can now limit the clock speeds all they want for segmentation purposes, and it's Intel that is now forced to release the best that they can with 5 GHz on all cores. And that is simply the difference between first and second place. So now to finish this part on Zen 2 off, on the pricing. Looking at the list again, and it's clear that AMD have given themselves a really nice payday. If I made one serious error that I regret in all of this, it was ever giving out prices. I just figured that most people should be able to understand that branding and pricing can change at any minute. So take any preliminary pricing, especially with a grain of salt. The fact about pricing is that it is almost wholly dependent on competition at the time. As I mentioned a while ago, when AMD launched the 1800X, it was $500. The 2700X, $330. That was only 1 year later. Even though it was a faster chip, it cost much less. And the reason for that was Intel had released their new 6-core chips as well. Coffee Lake launched in between these two, and competition was much stronger against the 2700X. But for sure, if I didn't scrutinise something hard enough, it was the prices. And also, let's call it new AMD. The thing here is, Lisa Su is a different kind of CEO from previous AMD CEOs. She's successful for a start, and also margin focused. Previous AMD CEOs fought a market share battle with cheaper prices, whereas Lisa is content to take less unit share at higher prices. And that's another major reason why these chips are branded and priced as they are. And it doesn't bode well for Navi's prices either. And while this kind of thing is great if you're an AMD shareholder, it's not quite so great if you're a consumer. And that's why when the 16-core chips land, later, they will cost a lot more than $500. There's no reason to believe it won't have a higher boost clock at least than this 3900X, because the silicon will be better. 5 GHz at stock? We'll see, but I don't think so. Maybe they're saving those ones for Threadripper instead. And this is essentially what I believe now. AMD has really segmented their lines, and they are really going for the big money here. It's risky, and it could backfire, as we know what the enthusiast mindset is like, especially when it comes to gaming. In the end, performance is what matters, but IPC is much more difficult to market than gigahertz. That's another reason why Intel just released the 9900KS with 5 GHz on all cores. They also know exactly what they need to do in order to remain relevant in the enthusiast space. Not all cores are equal, and it is to continue winning in gaming. That's how they stay ahead, with higher clock speeds. And you can't say that they aren't trying. They are giving everything they've got, because now they have to. AMD, on the other hand, appear to be already sandbagging, while Intel's body is still warm. You are not in that strong a position yet, AMD. And don't think for a minute you can take the enthusiast space for granted the way that Intel and Nvidia has done for years. Right, to finish this video off, back to the website again. I asked you to contact me if you had any article contribution ideas. And surprise, surprise, I was absolutely blasted by offers. Over 100, in fact. And to top that off, check out how most of them were formatted. Yep, this email, it just all runs together. There is no formatting in it whatsoever. We've been having a few email issues on the site, as I mentioned. And one of them was there just wasn't any formatting to these contact forms. So I have got over 100 of these to read like this. And I'm just not going to do it. I'm sorry, but there's too much on top of everything else I have to do. So what I've actually done is created a mailbox called contributions@adoredtv.com. And our editor Donnie has also managed to fix up the problem. So now if you click on this contribute menu, and then there's a contributor account, there's a new contribution form which does actually work and formats the emails properly. So if you're still interested, then please feel free to contact us again, either directly to contributions@adoredtv.com or through this now working contribution form. I've also got Donnie to help this time from checking through these because, yeah, I can't do 100 by myself. Just be aware that things may move very slowly on this, so anything that is time critical, it's likely going to be too late. I just did not expect such a massive interest in this idea. And oh yeah, there's some more merchandise too. And I believe if you check out the video description, it should now also be automatically integrated into YouTube. So feel free to check out that. And I'll catch you later, guys.